in ancient ethics, there was this idea that there are some cardinal virtues, and Aristotle plays along with this idea. And he agrees, for instance, with Plato that the four cardinal virtues are justice, temperance, wisdom, and courage. And he tries to say that in a sense, justice is supreme. It's a sovereign virtue.
Mm-hmm.
And he says that justice is perfect virtue, but in connection to other people, in relation to other people.
Mm-hmm.
This is a weird way of phrasing it, because he wants to say that when we look at virtue on its own, we're looking at the possession of a particular habit,
Mm-hmm.
the habit to act virtuously. But when we are but justice, we talk about justice as a supreme virtue when we see how people exercise these virtues in relation to other people.
Mm-hmm.
So what would you say about this notion of justice as a sovereign virtue? What do you think of it?
I understand what he's trying to say here, because what he's trying to articulate is that for true justice, and justice in the actual sense of the word, not necessarily how it's carried out practically, you need to consult all of your virtuous faculties. It's something that requires all aspects of the virtues you've cultivated to manifest in the world, because he's basically trying to say that it's the most difficult, indirectly here, isn't he? Because he's suggesting that, well, if you're to determine what is just and what is not, well, you've got to embody virtues in all of the other areas. And of course, that's a very difficult thing to do. I mean, he's kind of setting himself up for failure in a way, because no one is perfectly virtuous. So by merit of that fact, no one is truly fit to distribute any justice in the first place, because no one has the virtuous qualifications to do so. Although I'm not entirely sure he makes this argument, it's somewhat implicit in what he's saying.
I think that it's weird, and there is something that I'm troubling with when I think about virtue ethics, is that on the one hand, there is this notion of the unity of the virtues, and many authors think that virtues come as a package. You either possess all of them and you're virtuous, or you don't possess them and you're not virtuous. But it seems to me this isn't very appealing to me.
It seems a bit of a strong claim, doesn't it? I don't think it's so either or. I think that there's an association between the virtues, but I don't think it's quite as strong as you either have them or not.
I think we can definitely talk about degrees of virtue. That is why I think, as you said, that it's a bit harsh, because we have lots of people who are not perfect, but they're definitely more virtuous than other ones.
Yes, it doesn't make sense to hold someone up as being perfectly virtuous, because, of course, it's also impossible to assess who's perfectly virtuous, because it's a very subjective thing. And you might be projecting your own lack of virtue on the world, potentially. But you can certainly say, well, this person's more virtuous than that person. Like someone who's worked to save hundreds of people's lives is more virtuous than a serial killer. I think everyone would agree with that, except maybe serial killers. But in that case, it's entirely obvious, right, who the person who's embodying virtue is, because they're acting in a way to others that is embodying the virtues which Aristotle is talking about.
And he takes this notion of sovereign virtue to a conclusion that maybe we would not be very happy with nowadays, or we would to an extent. He wants to say that people with supreme virtue, with sovereign virtue, should become, in a sense, rulers. This is definitely Plato's notion, that those who are supreme in virtue should become philosopher kings.
Yes.
But Aristotle also wants, and this is a bit more in the politics, he also has this idea that we should have people who possess practical wisdom, the virtue of practical wisdom, into positions of power where they have the ability to influence things for the better. And if they do so, we are going to live in a more humane community, because people are going to legislate in a way that makes more virtuous citizens. That is why he focuses on the importance of education first, and then with respect to laws, and also with respect to orders, and when it is expedient to make them. So how do you react with respect to this? How do you find this idea?
Well, I'm kind of a bit conflicted, because on the one hand, of course you want people to lead you who are the most virtuous, because you don't want to have bad leaders, do you?
Yeah.
But on the one hand, who decides? How do you establish this? And to my mind, this seems like a backdoor to tyranny, because if you say, well, these are the most virtuous people, they know better than you, therefore you should give them absolute power, more or less, over your life, because they embody virtues and you don't. And it seems like a good way of rationalizing a tyrannical dictatorship where the normal person has no agency over their own life, because you have a benevolent, virtuous person who makes decisions for them. It's not necessarily arguing for that, and I don't think that that's what Aristotle's going for, but trying to flesh out this concept and how it would manifest in the world, well, then you have some problems.
So you would say that it's not that this is what Aristotle has in mind. He's not arguing for tyranny, but you would think that it's an implication of his view that it can have such bad manifestations.
Yes, yeah. I think that if you put virtue above all else, then, and you've got to have someone who determines who's virtuous, because who can become a leader, well, in practicality, you're not going to be able to have that impartial judge of character.
Yeah. So there's this question that is really pertinent to this discussion as to what should the range of political decision-making be, and whether there should be things that should not be matters subject to political decision. I agree with you that the way we should be very careful when we read ancient texts and texts about ancient politics, and when we try to translate them in contemporary discussions, because the world we live nowadays is completely different than the world of the city-states that Plato and Aristotle lived in.
Mm-hmm.
And we should be mindful of it. And yes, there can be bad manifestations, but it's to me, it's not so much the notion of virtue that is the problem, but as you said before, implicitly, I think, or explicitly, that it's how we determine virtue. So let's say, in an abstract sense, it's not a problem to say that the more meritorious people, the more virtuous people should rule.
Mm-hmm. I think that's pretty much what most people think. They might have different definitions of who the most virtuous person is, but
exactly,
they hold the same abstract ideal for what they look for in leadership.
Yeah. And that's a big problem that, for instance, we also have with Plato. Mm-hmm. That who decides who should become the philosopher ruler? Who decides which class you should be a member of?
Basically arrived at politics, haven't we?
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.